Well, it's Friday, so it's Excel Friday. So time to cheer and shout, but the problem is this is our last Excel Friday. So a little bit sad. It's like graduation. It's like you're just kind of like you're excited to be graduated, but you're gonna have a little bit of sorrow. That's kind of how you should feel about Excel Friday. Maybe not that level of enthusiasm, but so just as a reminder, we have one more chapter. We're doing chapter 14, which is actually a pretty interesting chapter on cybersecurity and fraud. We're doing that on Monday. Wednesday, we will have a very brief class session. We will run through homework. We don't have anything additional on top of that, the way that things work out. Friday will be our exam review. If you are traveling, I strongly recommend that you try to make it via Zoom if at all possible. It'll be a very, very important class session. If you're not able to attend, if you're going to be traveling and not be able to watch the video, make sure you complete the practice exam ahead of time. Practice exam study guide are both available on Brightspace right now, so you can start working on that. There's a lot to this next exam. It's very similar to the previous exam, but it's going to be a lot of things we got to cover. So keep that in mind. If you've not already signed up for a time slot to present for the final week, please make sure you do that. That's coming up as well. I think mostly it's just Friday it's left over, so I think you can sign up for that. But just for context, we have our second exam on the Wednesday of week 14, not on Monday, because Monday is our term break. It's right after Easter, so we won't be meeting. So yeah, there will be some extra time to study, but that also means that we've got a little bit of break between the time that we study for the exam, that we review the exam, and we'll actually take it. The Friday of week 14, we will review the results of the exam. We'll talk about the implications moving forward. I usually have a big, long articulation and discussion about what that means for grades for the final week and whether or not you have to take the final exam and things like that. And I'll talk about that in context to everything else. For today, though, we're just going to be an Excel wrap up. So this Excel Friday is a little bit interesting in the fact that it feels somewhat disaggregated from everything else. It just kind of seems like, what did you come up with these Excel functions, Dr. Barnes? They don't make sense in context to one another. To be honest, this particular one is just looking at what we're expected to cover in Excel functions for our courses, because we actually have a list of things that we cover in Excel in every course. And for 367, it's obviously a pretty substantial list. But anything that's on that list that I have not covered in previous sessions is where it got added to the list. So let's go ahead and get into it. Some of the stuff is, I will say, I don't know the context you would ever use these functions. And there's probably some situation or scenario that I'm thinking about. We'll talk a little bit about those. Some of these I use actually pretty frequently, but we'll discuss those in a bit. The first one is going to be a surprise. So you remember I talked about VLOOKUPs, and I still use VLOOKUPs because I'm old school, and that's what I learned back in the day. I know XLOOKUPs are technically superior, and I don't want to admit it. It's me just hanging on to the past. It's like an old boomer basically saying, the way things used to be is much, much better, which is a patently untrue statement, okay? Patently untrue statement. Things are much better now than the way they used to be. We got so much better technology, so much more informational progress, just a lot more intelligence. But you get people my age who are just kind of like, I wish things were simpler. The way back in the day, when you wanted to talk to somebody, you didn't text them, you picked up a phone and you called them, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, I'm an Excel boomer. I'm going to admit that. All right. This is the one time in the semester that you are allowed to say, okay, boomer, and it's appropriate. Okay. If you do that, send me outside of the classroom, you have to specify, I was talking about you with respect to Excel, okay? If you say, okay, boomer with an expect, I'm going to say, I am not boomer, I am Gen X, thank you very much. But Excel boomer, I definitely am. So this was a surprise to me when I found out a shortcut that I really liked. This is actually the concatenate shortcut, but it's called the ampersand function or the and function. So let's talk a little bit about that. So remember we talked about concat or concatenate functions early on and how they can combine information together. There's actually a much easier way to do that. And it goes against all convention we've talked about in Excel. Because the way that Excel functions traditionally work is you have to start with the function and then you fill in the arguments of the function afterwards. Somebody at Microsoft said, that's really, really outdated. Let's do something that's a little bit more intuitive. So let's do that. Let's go and see what the and function can do. Here's what I want you to do. This is why you guys are paying me the big bucks, by the way. We are going to concatenate the word concatenate. All right. I just think it's appropriate. So we're going to go equals, and I want you to highlight B3. Then after that, I just want you to hit shift and then once you're holding a shift, hit your number 7, because that's the ampersand symbol. And then go highlight C3. That is all there is to it. That is so much simpler than typing out the word concatenate or even the shortened version concat. It's just easier to do. It's easier to think about. I have adopted this wholeheartedly. This is one of those points where I've just actually moved on. Someday I may be even doing V lookups, who knows, or sorry, X lookups, who knows, okay? But for right now, that's the only kind of new vernacular accepted. And of course, we can actually use this in context of what we talked about before. Remember our original concat arguments, we actually concatenated my name. So let's go ahead and do that with the new arguments. So B4, we're going to do the ampersand symbol again. Remember that we have to add a space, so text or sorry, quote open, space, quote, ampersand symbol, and C4. That's how you would concatenate your name. Again, much simpler, a lot fewer characters used, a lot less work performed in aggregate. All right, next is going to be talking about the value function. Now, have I used the value function? The answer is yes. I could probably count outside of this classroom, I count the number of times on one hand that I've used the value function. And value is pretty much as it stands for. It's taking something that is formatted as a non-value field and putting it into a numeric function. So if you'll notice over here, we got the number 1000, and it's got that little green box in the upper left-hand corner, which gets that error. It says this is formatted as text preceded by an apostrophe. You may actually incur that if encounter that if you ever are working in Excel spreadsheets and something gets copied over from text, but it's actually left into a text format. So there's a few ways to go about this. The easiest way to go about this is just to click on this little yield sign, and you can actually say convert to number. And that's what I do most of the time. But there might be reasons why I don't want to do that. And part of that might be with data integrity, is that I receive the file and I want to retain the integrity of the original data. So I'm going to do a manual conversion of this. And this is where we'd use the value function. So hopefully you didn't click on convert to number. If you did, click back, because we need to actually leave this as a text field. We want to actually, for our purposes here, we want this to have that ugly green arrow in the upper left-hand corner. Okay. So let's go ahead and go over to F7. And we're going to use the value functions. Equals value, not value, value. They get older and older, the typos become more and more apparent. We're just going to highlight B7. That's going to convert that to a number. Now, the relevance of that is kind of minor. It becomes a lot more relevant when we want to do numeric conversions on fields that are numeric representations, but not presentations. So these a good example of this would be time of day and date. So let's go ahead and I want to copy Control C, my F7 function. I'm going to copy this down. Instead of hitting Control P for, Control V for paste, let's go ahead and go up to the drop down here. And let's just copy in the formulas. And the reason I did that is because I have these formulas formatted differently in F8 and F9. If you just Control V, it's going to copy both the format and the formula. So that's why I want to just copy the formula over. And this is interesting because this actually reinforces something we've talked about already in this class, is that time and date fields are just numeric conversions. So think about, if we think of a day as being a unit of 1, what is 11:30 a.m.? It's like almost half of the day. So 11:30 a.m., this class hours is 0.4792. And this date, 45,758, that's a numeric conversion. That's the number of days since January 1st, 1900. Which we talked about earlier in the semester. So that's an easy way to consider numeric conversions. Is this relevant? It's occasionally relevant. I'm not going to say that this is something that you're going to use very frequently, but it's good to know that you can use this. All right, for the next one, I'm going to tell you right now, outside of this class, I have never used this. Is there some way that you might actually find some relevance for this next function? Certainly, that's one reason why we're using it. I can tell you personally, practically speaking, in 52 years, probably about 30 of which of those have been used using Excel. I cannot think of a lot of scenarios where I would use this. All right. This is the text function. This is just basically the opposite. This is taking something that's a numerically presented field and converting it to a text presentation. So let's just talk about this, how we can do this. So we're going to go down to cell F12, and in that we're going to say equals B12. Sorry, my apologies, not equals B12, equals text, then B12. And then it actually asks you how we're going to format the text. And this is for the reason that we would actually be using the text field is we want to format that particular numeric value into a particular format, predefined format. So let's say that we wanted to present this in terms of percentages. If we have the number 1, what is that in percentage terms? 100%. Okay, so let's go ahead and give it a percentage format. So we're going to hold on open quotes, 0.00, and then we're going to say percentage. And this is just basically telling Excel we want this term presented in terms of percentage to 2 decimal places. So text B12, open quote, 0.00 percentage, close quote. There we have the conversion. 1 is equal to 100%. Again, not a lot of scenarios where you're going to find that you're going to find this useful. It will come up, I assume. It's never come up for me other than teaching class. I guess maybe technically it did come up because I have to teach in this class now. So there it is. If you're ever teaching an AIS class in the future, which you never know what path you're going to be going down, that will come up. All right. Something that does come up quite frequently is actually this next function. This is the link function. Okay. So everybody familiar with Mary Poppins? Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. All right, I was waiting for a round of applause due to my singing, but it didn't come up there. I say I'm never going to sing, but I did it last semester, so apparently I'm going to sing every semester. Yeah, it's a good old Disney movie that's actually now a Broadway musical. So yeah. So how many words or how many letters are in supercalifragilisticexpialidocious? Well, you can count the letters, but we actually can. So we have to in Excel. Let's just use the length function to figure that out. So length, open parentheses, B15, close parentheses. 34 letters in supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. So now your trivia parties, it's like you're answering trivia questions, and one of the trivia questions is in the Mary Poppins musical, their song supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. How many letters are in the word supercalifragilisticexpialidocious? And you can either say, oh, I remember this from the AIS, it's 34 letters, or you can pull out your Excel spreadsheet and figure that out. Okay, one of the two, either one is possible. Now, as for a real word, this was actually made up for the Disney movie, but the musical. But what about a real word? So we got pneumona ultramicroscopic silicovolcaniconiosis, which you may say, how did you know that, Dr. Barnes? The answer is because when I was in high school, my friends and I memorized useless pieces of trivia like this. Okay, so there's that. One of this is an example of this is the longest word in the English language. It's actually not all that impressive. It's a form of pneumonia, which is like pneumonia. It's actually a form of pneumonia that's isolated to inhalation of coal vapors. It's a coal miner's disease. So we can do the same thing. We can actually just use the same formula to figure out how many letters are in this word. 45 letters. Okay, 45 letters in the longest word in the English language. There's also another word that I really like. It's a fish, Hawaiian fish. Huma huma nuku nuku apua. Has anybody heard that one? Yeah, it's a really good one too. I don't know off the top of my head how to spell that one, but it's probably as it sounds. Maybe for future versions of this exercise, we'll actually just go with really long words and see how the link is. That really is not the point. Okay, the length function by itself is kind of standalone. It can be useful, but let's look at a practical example of how we can actually use this. So I've got 2 names, Michael Barnes and Stacy Caden. All right. And I want to separate out the information. I want to separate out Michael and Stacy I want to separate out last names. Now, there's a few ways to go about this. You could do a text to columns division, which is probably the easiest way to go about it. But to illustrate the link function, let's say that we want to use this because the names themselves, Michael and Stacy, are different links. Michael is 7 letters and Stacy is 6 letters. Oh, and it's a funny story. Last semester, I said Michael was 6 letters. I've had this name for 53 years. And of course, I couldn't count the number of letters in my own name. So yeah, it's 7 letters. And I'm never going to forget that now. At least that's what I tell people. And we want to actually have a rolling distribution so that we can separate out the last names despite the length of the first name. So let's go ahead and do a disaggregated series of formulas. Then we're going to merge the formulas together. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to do the same length function, but this time we're going to select C17. So like I said, Michael is 7 letters. Stacy is 6 letters. I'm not sure why the borders are not holding up there. There we go. Now, I can use that information to be able to split out the detail from the full name. So I'm going to go ahead and use the mid formula. And we'll select the full name, Michael Barnes. And that's going to say start number. And I'm going to use the information in the length formula that I just calculated. So F17, I'm going to add a 1 because I want to start after the space. Because remember, all the names have a space between first and last name. And then this one says number of characters. I'm just going to put an arbitrary large number of characters because I want to actually pick up the largest last name. So we can type in something like 50. If you want to put in 100, if you want to put in 1 million, it doesn't really matter as long as it's large enough to catch large names, large last names. The actual number that you put in here is not relevant as long as it's a big number. And then presumably, if I've done this correctly, it will actually do the same thing for Stacy Caden, but it will recognize the different cell here. Now the question comes up, can we do this in one function? And the answer is absolutely yes. So let's do this in one function. Let's go equals mid. Go over to B17. Then for start number, that's where I'm going to type in my length function. Say length C17. Before I go to the comma, though, I'm going to say +1. And then go comma, and that's where I type in the large number. I'm going to say 50. So mid B17 equals, or sorry, I don't know why I typed in the equal sign. We don't need an equal sign here because it's the argument function. My apologies. If anybody was confused about that, I apologize for the confusion. Length C17 +1, and then arbitrary large number of characters. So I split out my last name. And I split out Dr. Gaines' last name. And science fun. All right, a few more wrap-up functions. Let's talk about some date functions. So some of these functions are very intuitive. Some of these functions are completely non-intuitive. We're going to talk about all of them, all right? So the first one is very, very intuitive. It's also very simple. We're going to talk about how do we split out day, month, and year from the date functions, okay? So let's go ahead and just tap equals day, open parentheses, and we're going to go to this date, which is today's date, 4/11/2025. As you can probably guess, month is going to be the month function. Anybody want to guess what the year function is? Yep, it's year. Now, this is actually pretty simple, but it is pretty powerful because if we want to actually pull out arguments from a function, a predefined function, it can be challenging at times. I will say, and I'm going to admit this for the the last function we're going to do, I have done this in much more challenging details because I did not know about these functions. And I've said, all right, I'm just going to pull out the numbers based on where they occur within the argument. I copied and pasted over text versions of it, and then I split them out according to length. That was a much more challenging process than just using the date functions. All right, something that's a little bit more, I would say, a little bit more challenging, but actually can be a little bit more relevant is called the day of week function. Now, I want to make sure we're clear on this. There's no function called day of week. You can't actually just type in day of week. It is a function to identify the day of week, but the function itself is actually called a weekday, which is a little bit confusing because in American vernacular, weekday is Monday through Friday. In Excel vernacular, weekday is saying what day of the week this has occurred. So let's just type in equals weekday. Before you open the parentheses, I want to actually look at what it says. So if you look at the argument next to it, it says it returns a number 1 through 7, identifying the day of week of a date. So if you look at that, we're going to actually get a 1 through 7 number. So let's go ahead, open parentheses, and identifying that 4/11/2025. And it comes back with a value of 6. Now, is that intuitive? It says it should return a value. What does that tell you? Is that Friday is the 6th day of the week? Because we think of Sunday being the first day of the week. Now, if we think about it kind of our traditional value, you might say Monday is the first day of the week. But the Excel view is that Sunday is the first day of the week, Saturday is the last day of the week. So Friday being the 6th makes sense. If you're really, really kind of caught up about this and saying this does not provide me information, Dr. Barnes, let's go ahead and do something just a little bit nuanced, okay? I'm going to use a VLOOKUP function. You can use XLOOKUP if you want to, but I'm going to type in VLOOKUP. I'm going to look in my day of week. And then if we scroll over to the right, oops, I better scroll over to the right and a little bit up, you may notice that in columns M and N, look at that. I've got day of week next to day, the actual representative days. True, false. So that way we can actually specify it's Friday. It's a very simple conversion. Yes. Sure. And just to reiterate, this is a really, really awkward function because it's not intuitive. Day, month, and year are very intuitive. The day of week function is not intuitive. Again, the function of that is weekday. It's very, very confusing because we think, like I said, we think of weekday as Monday through Friday, but the weekday function for Excel is just saying, what is the day of the week? You think they would fix that and say, well, Microsoft is an American corporation, and we would actually go and say, let's just put a day of week in there. I'm not sure why they don't, but you know, not me to judge Bill Gates. One of us has more money than the other. Far more money than the other. All right. Let's go ahead and talk about end of month. So let's actually say we're in the middle of the month. We identify what's the date at the end of the month. Okay. This one's pretty basic. Equals EO month. And let's go ahead and say we're going to go back to our date function and be 21. Let's just say I want to know what this month is, what the end of the month is for this month. I'm just going to type in comma 0. Oops, this is weird. 45,777. Did I do something wrong? Yeah, yeah, everybody has that. This is actually the story behind this is that I forgot to format the date the very first time I did this, okay? And then I tried to tell my students I did that on purpose, okay? I actually did it on purpose, this one, but yeah, back when I first did this Excel assignment way back in the day, I didn't do it on purpose. I was like, I just forgot to format the field. Yeah, what this is a numeric conversion. We're just gonna go ahead and format the cells, changes to a date conversion. So it is correct, 4/30/2025, just the numeric version of that particular date. Just to reinforce what I've been saying all along is that these are actually numbers. They're just formatted in a different way. So this is the end of month for this month, which we all knew. April has 30 days. Everybody knew that. What do we want to learn the end of month for, say, 7 months from now? So you'll notice that we got 7 down here. So B21, comma, G22. It's going to give us November. So think about it. 7 months from now, you're gonna be wrapping up another semester, or for those of you who are graduating, you're gonna be like, oh my gosh, I'm in the work world, and I'm using Excel. Presumably you're using Excel. That's kind of what all business people use. Maybe you're doing something else. All right. Move on to this next function. This is called the net work days. All right. So I know it's going to be surprising, but for the most of the real world that works out there, they view work days as being Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. Since we're here at Truman State, we view work days as 7 days a week, Monday through Sunday. All right. But Excel actually kind of has the traditional vernacular. So let's go ahead and see if we can calculate the number of net work days we have between now and the end of the semester. So we're going to say equals net work days. We'll have our start date as B21. And you'll notice I put the end date right below, which is hard to see because the formula's in the way, but it's H22. So by the definition of Monday through Friday when we work, we've got 21 days between now and the end of the semester. Does that give you a little bit of anticipation? What's up?
So what is in the formula, what is the holidays bit for?
That's an excellent question. Okay. So some of you may say, Dr. Barnes, you're forgetting that next Thursday we have off of the Student Research Conference, or some of you may be presenting at the research conference. For those of you who are, good luck. I wish you the best. I'll probably be rooting you on. All right. Some of you may say, oh, we've got the day after Easter that we're not going to be here. So we've got 2 dates that are not in there. So we can modify this to include holidays. So let's go ahead. I believe the Student Research Conference, if we look at the calendar, is on the 17th. And the 21st is the day we have off Easter. So let's go ahead and type in 4/17/25 over here in I-21. Let's type in 4/21/25 in J-21. So these are holidays that we're going to identify that we're not going to be working in. Presumably, we're not going to be going to class. Maybe we'll still be working, okay? Because, yeah, Truman. But let's fix our formula now. So next H22, type in a comma. and then highlight I-22 and J-22. Now, this does need to be highlighted as series. If you do this as a comma, it will not work. Okay, you have to highlight all the dates as one input. And it will modify, say, hey, if you count those days as holidays, there's only 19 more work days. We can also include the days of exams, because let's be honest, those exams are basically days off, right? Yeah, what's up?
Is there a way to have a start month input the net work days and then have a populated date?
So populate, I
I'm
guess.
trying to figure out when 7 work days from now would be and have it pop up that date.
Oh, okay. Is there a way? Probably off the top of my head, I can't really think of it like this. But yeah, it sounds like a pretty natural because it's just a numeric conversion. So all you have to do is just figure out what exactly the number of days is, and then just add that to the number. So like if you say 19, I wanted to add 19 to the date that you actually identify, then it would do that automatically. So, but it would probably be a little more complex than that because the network days would not include those holidays. So you want to actually exclude the number of days and then include the number of all days and not just the network days in there. All right, last function for the semester. We're almost there, guys. So we're going to talk about the date function, which the date function is basically at its core somewhat useless. So we're going to put in today's date. So I'm going to type in equals date. It says year 2025, month April 4, and day 11. Congratulations. We've just done a function that was a much more complicated version of just typing in the date. Now, is this useful? The answer is yes, okay? I can say that this actually can be relevant. Because remember I was talking earlier about splitting out these day, month, and year into separate fields. And I did this like trying to actually copy it from a hard-coded field and then splitting out according to length. I've done the exact opposite conversion. I've actually tried to take these day, months, and years and then put them together using concatenate functions. And you'd like to say, well, Dr. Barnes, you must have learned a lot since the past 20 years. This was like 5 years ago I was doing that, okay? So I've learned a lot since then. So this can actually take disaggregated data and put it together. So let's go ahead and put the date function in again. Let's go ahead and pull out the information from the information we put up here. Date, month, or sorry, year, month, and day, which gives us the same information, but that was from inputs in the spreadsheet itself, which if you have a lot of those inputs can be very, very beneficial, can be very, very helpful. And that's it. That is all there is to it. Just as a reminder, this will be on the exam. This stuff we've covered on the Excel work. I want to remind you that if it is a function, you're responsible for knowing the components of that function, which I know sounds unfair. Everybody's going to say, well, Dr. Barnes, if we have Excel in front of us, we can automatically know what the inputs are, and I respect that, and I know that. But it is a limited number of functions, and I do think that if I've specified that you can actually focus on those. I will tell you, one that I've always asked questions on is going to be the index match function. So please make sure you spend some time knowing that. There will be a question on the index match function on the exam. And also just keep in mind that just when we're reviewing stuff on the spreadsheet, I will give you a study guide saying, know these formulas. Just go back and review those formulas. Some of the formulas can be non-intuitive, like the day of week function. Remember, the day of week function is weekday. It's a little bit counterintuitive. A lot of people tend to forget that, say, all right, I'm looking for the day of week function because I know all the date functions are intuitive. Not all of them are intuitive. So if you have a counterintuitive function like that, spend some time making sure you have some reinforcement of that. Other than that, this should be a fairly easy series of points. There are 3 questions on the exam over the Excel formulas. So this should be an easy 9 points for you to get just if you do a basic review of this information. All right. Last but not least, let's talk about some things I want to talk over with respect to ethics development and AI. So this actually comes from a activity developed by Dr. Bill Miller of Wisconsin Eau Claire. And this is on Brightspace. You may want to download this because we're going to be downloading or putting some prompts into Copilot. Part of this is just going to be a reflection of things that we've already talked about, but I do think that this can be very relevant for not just for business, but also how we can use these tools to reinforce our understanding of complex concepts. I will say the reason I chose ethics is because ethics is a traditionally very hard to objectify concept. It is very, very subjective in nature. It's there's a lot of qualification to it. And so I think reinforcement of it using these tools can be very beneficial. Now, for those of you who are accounting majors, and I know I've said this a lot, and I'm not trying to exclude people who are not accounting majors, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of heads up. This is a concept that I talk about also in auditing with respect to professional judgment. And so the things that we're going to talk about today, they are reflections of things that actually resonate at a higher level. For those of you who are not accounting majors, I still think that you're going to find value of this because I do think that cognitive biases are something that a lot of courses tend to focus on, particularly as you get to really high level courses and start thinking about the nature of professional judgment and critical thinking. So you should have some understanding of some of the 4 popular cognitive biases. Now, is this a comprehensive list? The absolute answer is no. These are 4 of the more common ones that exist right now. Now, if you've heard these before, you probably have some basic idea of what these represent. Some of these you may be familiar with, very familiar with. Like I think confirmation bias is one that everybody in this room has some familiarity with. This tends to be a problem in today's age of social media, is that a lot of people experience confirmation bias. But some of the other ones may be a little bit more less relevant. Like you may have heard of anchoring bias, but not really have some familiarity with it. Overconfidence bias, you may have heard that, Dunning-Kruger effects type things, but may not be as familiar. So what we're going to do, is we're going to talk about these 4 types of biases, and we're going to drill down into some explanation of them to provide some clarity for this. And we're going to use AI tools to do this. So here's the prompt. And again, you can copy and paste this prompt from the Excel file if you've got this downloaded. But here's what we're going to set up. You're an expert in the field of ethics and cognitive biases. We're going to prepare a table. And in the first column, we're going to list all of the biases. We're going to list those 4 biases. Secondly, provide a definition. And then third, we're going to provide a risk to the business person and the work they should, or their work, should they fall victim to the biases in the first column. And I will say, from my experience, I did this a few times, the response should be pretty consistent across. But I've got my Copilot open. I'm going to do it in Copilot, but I'm also going to show you what I did when I developed this activity a few days ago. So if you copied this from the PDF file, you probably came up with something like this. Now, one thing to note is this is the way it's looking right now. It's really hard to read and really hard to interpret. So a big advantage of this and using Copilot is you can actually pop this open in Pages. And then we'll actually put a table out here that's a little bit more formatable. A little bit easier to read. All I did is basically just scroll down to make this size that I could actually copy and paste this into my file. In case you're wondering how I got this information. So yeah, AI summary of cognitive biases. So yeah, anchoring bias to rely on the first piece of information encountered, which is an anchor when making decisions. This tends to be a quantitative anchor. So say, for example, you say, all right, I'm going to get my first job, and your employer comes in and says, all right, we're going to offer you $30,000. And you say, well, I'm a Truman State graduate. I've spent my past 4 to 5 years working and getting in the field. I was expecting a $70,000 salary. Their anchor is going to say, wow, that's just way too much because I'm basing it on my original assessment of $30,000. That's not necessarily a relevant piece of information, but they tend to use that piece of information as something that they use for subjective measurement. So that's kind of an example of anchoring bias. Availability bias intends to overestimate information that's readily available. So you are trying to research a project, and you've already done some preliminary research, and all the preliminary research guides in one direction. So then your instructor says, I'd like you to provide more research and more detail on that. And if you did so, you'd find that the more information, especially more recent information, provides you context that's not necessarily relevant to what your original conclusion is. So availability bias kind of guides you to one direction that's not necessarily appropriate. Confirmation bias we talked about before. You already have a pre-existing belief, and you only look at information that supports that. By the way, in the COVID pandemic, this was a real problem, okay, because there's a lot of pre-existing bias with respect to vaccines. And I don't want to open a can of worms because you may have your own opinion about that. But there was a lot of directional bias in both sides, okay? And then overconfidence bias tends to estimate one's own abilities and knowledge and predictions. I use Dunning-Kruger effect. Has anybody ever heard that term before? It's absolutely fascinating. So Dunning-Kruger is basically saying that because we're a social group of individuals, we're operating in society, that we tend to actually acclimate social abilities to our own abilities. So an example is if I said, how many people in this room know how a zipper works? So everybody would say, yeah, I use a zipper every single day, Dr. Barnes. So it's like, all right, explain it to me. And he's like, all right, it's a lot more complex than I just really realized. Okay. Zipper is one of those things. It seems really, really simple, but it's like, how do we actually know that the teeth catch and they hold? And what is the process for doing that? It's like, okay, all right, good example. Another one's really, really simple is like a toilet. Okay. And like say, yeah, a toilet works. Okay. I'm not going to talk about my use of a toilet, but I've used one at least recently. Okay. All right. So how does the toilet work? And it's like, okay, well, you press the lever and things happen. Yeah. It's one of those things that because somebody in society knows how this works and invent this, can operate on this, we assume our own knowledge of society. That's kind of the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's fascinating. It's one of those things that we're talking about overconfidence bias. So that's not the end of the story. Obviously, it's not me up here talking about ethics that we're trying to get here. What we're trying to do is we're trying to say, I want to focus more on particular biases and get a better explanation and provide more detail. How can I use the AI tool to do that? And the answer is we just need to be more specific in our prompts. So let's go ahead and talk about some more prompts that we can use to drill down. Let's say that you're very interested in availability bias, that you have some concerns about your own world and people in your discipline and their exposure to availability bias, and you want to do a little more detail on that. So let's go ahead and add a new prompt. Please revise the definition of availability bias and the associated example to include investor relying on historical financial statement information rather than current market information. So let's go ahead and copy that prompt over and see what happens. Now, I'll say that the next few steps are going to be a little bit awkward and clunky because you will notice what happens is it just took the original table and just added in the discussion about relying on historical financial information, which that's fine. Okay, that's okay. I'm not going to say that it's not what I wanted, but one of the things that you'll notice that pops up, I'm going to remove pages. You scroll down, is that it gives you some prompts right here. It says some real world examples of these biases. When I did the prompt earlier, and this is in the slides, it says add more examples for each bias. But let's go ahead and explore and see what happens if we can identify real world examples of these biases. This probably won't come up in a table the way that my prompt did, but it might provide some context for each of these. So let's go ahead and click on this and then use that as our next prompt. So yeah, this contextualizes a lot of what we're talking about here. And if we really wanted to, we can actually just add this to the table. Now, I don't think that's necessary. But let's go ahead. Let's move on to this prompt that I set up right here. So let's go ahead and provide 3 analogies of availability bias in business. Now, notice the language in here is a little bit vague. Okay, I'm not saying that I want availability biases in a business environment. I want to say I want an analogy to availability bias that exists in business. So the prompts that you get or the response you get will not necessarily be business environment analogies, but they'll be analogies that you can use to understand how availability bias exists within a business environment. At least that's what I got when I did my prompt before, but it looks like all the ones that I came up with are actually good business analogies, some marketing campaigns, hiring decisions, and product development. So it's pretty interesting stuff when we talk about the nature of availability bias and how we can drill down on that and how it actually relates to really real world decisions. So what are some things that we've talked about specifically in this course that might be relevant to availability bias? What was the thing that we just talked about? What was the topic that we talked about this week, chapter 13? The one that I had you drink the Red Bull for because it was so tedious and boring. Dr. Barnes, I don't remember this. I'm going to worry about this when we get to the exam because the exam is what's more important. It's like, yeah, says apparently the Red Bull was so powerful that it overwhelmed all existing memory of internal controls. Okay, remember internal controls? Okay, do you think that we have some issues with availability bias and internal controls? I could ask you to speculate, but what instead of speculation, what if we have the AI do that for us? Okay, so next problem. How does availability bias relate to the design, implementation, maintenance of proper internal controls in an accounting information system? What do y'all think? Do you think that the answer is it is exposed to availability bias or it's not? I'm gonna pop it in and see what happens. This is interesting, yes.
I think it would relate just because you might be considering more recent data breaches when developing your internal controls, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Interesting stuff is that we start drilling down and talking about how it affects design, implementation, and maintenance. So it talks about design phase, implementation phase, and maintenance phase. It goes into a little bit more detail here. It talks about specifically design, implementation, and maintenance. But let's look at the implementation guidance. This is the one that's on mine. You may have come to something different. So during implementation, which remember, keep in mind with internal controls, we got to create the controls, which is going to be the design. Then we've actually got to put them in place in the organization, which is our implementation, and update them as necessary. All right. So just focusing on one of these, during implementation, availability bias might cause managers to prioritize controls based on recent audit findings or incidents rather than a balanced assessment of all risks. This can result in an uneven control environment where some risks are over controlled while others are under controlled. So if we have a management that says, all right, we have controls in place that are relevant to the past year and a half, and we're looking or backward looking, and we're saying we're going to actually implement our controls to actually address risks that we know that have happened within the past year. We believe those are correct assessment of risks as we think. So is a historical assessment of risk, is that a proper approach for risk implementation? It's part of the picture. But what's missing if I say historical approach? So is the past the only thing that we should be concerned about when we think about controls? What else should we consider? There are three elements of time. There's past, present, and future. So we probably should think about the present and the future, okay? So let's say somebody was operating in March 2020 and say, I'm going to implement controls according to what happened in 2019, all right? Would they have an incomplete picture of risks at that point in time? Yes, because something happened in March 2009 or 2020 that people did not expect. Again, I know that I've used this example before, but it's a very apropos example because we know that that's going to affect a risk at that point in time because that's when the COVID pandemic hit. And did we need to actually maintain risks to address the problems in 2019, or should we think about what the risks are going to be in 2020 when all of the movie theaters are empty and everybody's ordering off Amazon? That's kind of an example right there. If the availability bias, if we only use available information from historical detail, then we're missing a big part of the picture. So that's a big example of how we would consider this from a controls perspective. All right, to wrap up, let's just talk really quickly. Can you provide a real example of where a business fell victim to availability bias? Let's just go ahead and put that in there. And I do want to talk, let's see what kind of examples you came up with. But I do want to talk about the one that I came up with the other day. I'm curious if it's going to be the same one. It's interesting. I came up with a completely different example. So Kodak's digital camera decision. So it's talking about how Kodak was dominant film and photography market. And basically they said that they were going to continue moving on with film. And that was going to be their bread and butters. They're going to continue on with cameras that actually operated using film, like traditional photography. And they ignored the market of the fact that was kind of growing. This was the 1990s and 2000s, where cameras themselves were standalone tools that could actually have the photograph stored within electronic means or electronic and storage means. So how many people have actually seen an actual film-based camera? Drew's not here today. I'm sure Drew would probably be able to identify that. But like, yeah, a film-based camera, those don't really exist in big volumes nowadays. It's mostly everything's a digital camera, okay? And so the digital market kind of took over, and Kodak actually had to file for bankruptcy in 2012, okay? Has anybody actually heard the name of the Kodak? I don't know what capacity they still exist. Back in the 70s and 80s, they were everywhere, okay? All the cameras were based on Kodak film. So one that I thought was really interesting, this is actually the example that it came up with on my example from a few days ago, 2008 financial crisis, okay? So availability bias. So 2008 subprime financial crisis. Everybody familiar with that concept? Have you talked about it in your classes before? What was the root cause of the subprime financial crisis?
Thanks for the investors with terrible credits that they would probably default on the bonds.
Right. So basically, anybody who wanted to get a loan on a house could get a loan. In fact, they were encouraging really, really bad loans because those are really high interest rates. People who wanted to get these mortgages were paying like 10 to 20% interest rates because their credit was so bad. What was the rationale? Why was the availability bias such a problem in that? Saying the mortgage market in the United States has never failed before. It's not going to fail in the future. Was that a true statement moving forward? No, as we all know, there was a big financial crisis. It was because of the collapse of the mortgage market, because everybody said this is never going to fall apart. It hasn't in the past, and so it won't fall apart in the future. By the way, in case you're curious about this is one of my favorite movies of all time. It's called The Big Short, and it's actually a very, very it's a fascinating film. It's actually by Adam McKay, who was collaborated with Will Ferrell on Talladega Nights and Anchorman and some of those old films. He's actually a very smart guy. He actually has done some other films that are a little bit more nuanced. This one's kind of a humorous depiction of the whole scenario, and it does a lot of fourth wall breaks to kind of get home the story. But if you've never watched this film, I strongly recommend it. This is not an assignment for this class, okay? This is just my personal piece of information to learn about the 2008 financial crisis and why the availability bias was such a problem in that scenario. But yeah, that would kind of be the ultimate takeaway, is that you can kind of come up with some insights and some suggestions that you can actually use to reinforce your understanding. All right, we're done for this week. Back for chapter 14 on Monday. Have a good weekend.